In the deep time before memory, when the world was young and the first people walked the earth, there was no word for war. They lived in small family bands. They hunted, gathered, shared fire, and raised their young. Food was hard, winters were long. Sometimes two bands met at the same water or the same hunting ground. At first, they simply watched each other. Then one band took what the other needed. Anger grew. Stones were thrown, spears were raised. What began as a quarrel between a few became something new. The first organized fight between groups. This is the story of that moment, the First War. Long before cities or kings, people lived in small roaming bands of 20 or 30. Each band knew every face. They shared the same fire, the same stories, the same danger. But the land could not always feed everyone. When game grew scarce, bands moved farther. Sometimes their paths crossed. At first, the meetings were careful and quiet. They exchanged looks, sometimes gifts of food or tools. But hunger does not stay polite for long. One season, the herds failed. Two bands arrived at the same river crossing on the same day. Neither wanted to leave. Words were spoken, then louder words. A young man from one band grabbed a fish from the water. A man from the other band struck him. Blood fell on the ground for the first time between strangers. That single blow changed everything. The two groups stood frozen for a heartbeat. Then the first spear flew. It struck a man in the shoulder. A cry tore through the air. Both sides charged at once. Clubs swung, spears thrust. Bodies slammed into bodies. Dust rose and mixed with the first real blood. A young warrior fell and did not get up. His family watched from the edge. One side began to push the other back. Stones and broken spears littered the ground. The air filled with shouts and the sound of wood on bone. A leader from one band raised his arm and called for a pause. Slowly, the fighting stopped. Both sides stared at what they had done. 3 men lay still. Others sat holding wounds that would never fully heal. No one cheered. The First War had lasted less than the time it takes the sun to move the width of a hand. Yet nothing would ever be the same. The survivors of both bands began to gather their wounded. They no longer looked at each other as strangers. They looked at each other as enemies. That single word had not existed before this morning. Now it would never leave them. The wounded were carried home on rough stretchers of wood and hide. Behind them, the place of the fight fell silent. But the story of what happened there began to travel. Other bands would hear it, and some of them would remember. The story moved faster than any hunter. By the next full moon, distant bands had already heard. Some listened in silence. Others began to sharpen more spears that night. Fear entered the camps before any stranger did. Children were kept closer. Sentinels began to stand at the edges of every band. The idea of our people grew sharper, and the idea of the others grew darker. Some bands tried to make contact carefully. Others answered only with raised weapons. A second fight broke out near a dry riverbed. This time both sides came prepared. They had chosen the ground. They had decided who would strike first. The second war was shorter, but it was more deliberate. When it ended, one band was driven from the water source. The losers carried their dead and walked into uncertainty. The winners stood over the water and felt something new. It was not only survival. It was the first taste of dominance. From that day, some bands began to plan for conflict before it arrived. They chose high ground. They stored extra weapons. They taught the young how to stand in a line. What had been a single terrible accident was becoming a pattern. The First War had taught them that groups could be destroyed, and that knowledge could never be unlearned. From this point forward, every band lived with the possibility of the next fight. The possibility of the next fight changed how people slept. It changed how they walked. It changed the stories they told their children. The First War became a warning, but it also became a temptation. Some leaders began to see strength in numbers. Bands that once avoided each other now sought allies. The world of small roaming families began to tighten. Boundaries appeared where none had existed. Crossing those boundaries without permission became dangerous. The First War had created the first borders, and borders demanded memory. They began to mark the places where blood had been spilled. Those places became warnings for the next generation. Yet the same places also became challenges. Some would come to test their strength where others had fallen. The first war had ended, but the age of war had begun. From that day, every generation would inherit the knowledge, they would inherit the fear, they would inherit the readiness, and they would inherit the choice. The first war lasted only moments. Its consequences would last as long as people remembered. And people always remember the first time blood was spilled between groups. That memory sits inside every later war. It is the quiet ancestor of every organized fight that came after. The first war did not need kings or cities. It needed only two groups, one resource, and the moment when anger became decision. And once that decision was made, the world of the first people was never the same again. The first war left no monuments of stone. It left only a change in the eyes of those who survived. That change passed from parent to child without words. It settled into the way groups looked at strangers. It settled into the weight of a spear held ready. The first war taught humans that they could end one another. And once that lesson was learned, it could never be forgotten. Every later conflict carries a faint echo of that first morning. The raised voices, the first thrown stone, the moment when a group decided to move as one against another. These things still live inside every organized fight. The first war was not the largest. It was simply the first, and first things shape everything that follows. The people who fought that day could not have known. They only knew that something irreversible had happened. They walked away carrying a new kind of silence. That silence still exists. It lives between groups that do not trust each other. It lives in the moment before a decision is made. The first war gave humanity a new capacity, the capacity to destroy, and the capacity to remember why it must sometimes be refused. That is the true inheritance of the first war.